Well, I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind why we're asking this question. It's because I would say two things, that there's a wave of reaction, right-wing reaction of various types across the world. The re-election of Donald Trump symbolizes it. But there's a second aspect of that question, which is what are the differentiations between all these different parts of the far right? Are any of them fascist? Are none of them fascist? I'm sure you come across it on social media. You certainly have attacks from the right wing, the radical right, saying this isn't fascism and the reason you're calling it fascism is because the left has called everything it doesn't like fascist. Now, I'm not going to use the phrase there's an element of truth in that, but there's an element of weakness on the left of not having been clear that fascism is a distinct force of the radical right, a particularly dangerous force of the radical right, and it's not just a series of bigotries held against minorities or against majorities, as in the case of women. So it's very important to be clear about what fascism is and isn't. I'll give you one practical reason. Over last summer, over the August, you had the attempted pogroms, race riots, at the centre of which were the far right, which can be called fascist, the people aligned with Tommy Robinson and so on. It was an attempt to organise a pogrom, a racial attack, to kill people. And there was a spontaneous and semi-spontaneous response to that of a particular form which was effective. Now we have not that so much, but we have the breakthrough of Nigel Farage's Reform Party. It didn't organise the racist gangs last year, although its propaganda led to the racist gangs last year. So the way in which we're having to deal with reform is different from, I was staying in Walthamstow as I'm over, mobilising 7,000 people on the streets of Walthamstow to stop Nigel Farage marching. Nigel Farage is not marching. So we do need to distinguish these things. And what I want to do is go through the rise of fascism in the interwar period and what fascism became in the 1930s and how it ruled, as a kind of set of pointers and enable us to make some general points to then look at the situation today and how we analyse the range of the far right and radical right here and in other countries. There's not just Donald Trump. The German election is 7 days away, and the AfD, really a fascist party, is likely to come second in Germany with over 20% of the vote, likely. A fascist party in Austria, the FPÖ, is the largest party, and there's going to be another election, and it will become even larger. Now, I want to make this cautionary point. It's often when there's comparisons with the interwar period, there's comparisons with what the far right looks like now and what the Nazis looked like in 1933. And that can lead to a kind of checklist approach. You know, have they got squads on the streets? Yes or no? Have they got an explicit anti-Semitic ideology? And we go through and say, how do these two pair up? Now, it's not disastrous, but it's not a particularly useful way of looking at it. I think a better way of looking at it is how fascism develops, not where it ended up with the gas chambers and with the complete seizure of power in 1933, 1934, but how it emerged in the course of the 1920s. Because I think when we look at it that way, and it's a good Marxist way of looking at things generally, actually, not just what is, but how did it come to be and where is it going? That's part of the Marxist approach to things. It's useful for us because in looking at that process, I think we can see some parallels, some echoes and some pointers to the actual situation we're in today, which is not 1932 or 1933, but is somewhere in the 1920s, in the interwar period. So let's look at that period. The first third of the 20th century was dramatically turbulent, although it didn't seem to be that it would be like that at the very turn of the century. The economy was doing well, there was stabilization, there was an advancement of rights. World trade was spreading, such that lots of people said you can't have wars anymore because the Americans are investing in Germany and the British are investing in Russia. That crashes down in the First World War. The outcome of the First World War, which is absolutely devastating in Europe, reorders Europe on the back of the Russian Revolution, which is what really brings it to an end. And you have an intense period of struggles in countries whose state structures, in some ways, had been broken, and empires broken up into their component parts, and so on. Incredibly bitter past struggle, revolution and counter-revolution from the northern coast of Germany all the way through to Bulgaria. Counter-revolution against the revolutionary impetus inspired by the Russian Revolution does become victorious, first of all through direct military repression. And in the course of the military repression, and you see it's in Italy especially, you see this new force emerging, and it's explicit in Italy, of demobbed soldiers who lost what humanity they had in the First World War, millions of men, in a desperate situation, scooped up by reactionary forces in order to stop them being scooped up by the revolutionary forces based upon the working class. And to an extent that continues throughout the 1920s. Sorry. There is some stabilization, but certainly in Germany, and I'm going to focus on Germany because it's the most important example, the attempt to create a new stability with concessions to the workers' movement and to the socialists who had been crucial to stop the socialists, that is the Labour-type socialists, who'd been crucial to stopping the revolutionary surge in the early 1920s. That attempt never really stabilizes. And so it's resented by the historic right, and it's resented by these new militant right-wing forces of various kinds. And to look at the range of these forces, Germany had lost territory, there was a sense of national crisis and decline. You had what would become the Hitler formation in the form of these demobilized army officers who looked to methods of coup and so on to restore Germany and restore the right and seize power. Indeed, Hitler tried that in 1923. All the way through to people of the old order, the generals and so on, and their centre-right parties, right-wing parties, looking to do it their way to restore the German Empire and to contain the working class that they'd had to give all sorts of concessions to. And so the course of the 1920s, you go through one government and process after another, becoming more and more radicalized on the right, and the state being used more and more in an authoritarian way, not just in Germany. A strike in Britain in the mid-1920s would involve very strong degrees of violence and pickets, coal miner pickets, killed on the picket line. Big crisis in the late 1920s, out of which the Nazi Party, the fascists, grow very quickly. Now, why and what were they? First of all, part of their appeal at that point with the Wall Street crash and sudden dislocation of society is that unlike the traditional old right, who were nostalgia, German Empire and so on, they were for all of those things, but they also had a pseudo anti-capitalist rhetoric. So that is, you've been hit by the crisis, particularly the shopkeepers and the people in the middle class and so on. The workers, the socialists, who we hate, they've got some defense in the trade unions. They can band together. You haven't got a trade union. The capitalists, they're running the economy and they can push down below. So you in the middle have got no force, no social force. We will give you a social force. By banding you together, you know, the symbol of the Italian fascists was the axe bound together with sticks. We'll band you together. We can hit upwards and we can hit against the working class movement as well, who we have all sorts of problems with. How do you tie those things together ideologically? That we have a certain anti-capitalism and we're definitely anti-socialist. The anti-Semitism was crucial to that because they said we're not against domestic German capital, we're not against patriotic bosses, we're against the Jewish capitalists, the internationalist capitalists. Today's the globalizers. We're not against workers. In fact, we're for workers standing up for themselves. We're against the Marxist socialists because they're against the nation. were for the German worker, the German capital and the German worker. In order to advance that, they had to break into the political system, which itself was breaking apart. Both the Social Democratic Party and the traditional old parties of the right. They were going through a process of what the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci described as the decomposition of the party. What he meant by that was that ruling class parties usually bind together all of the capitalist class, despite their different immediate interests, into a powerful bloc to rule. When that starts to break down, you have it fragmenting into its different economic elements, the industrialists versus the farmers, one group of farmers against another. And how are you going to bring that together to get out of the chaos of complete parliamentary logjam and no one with a plan to restore order? The Nazi Party offered itself as being able to do that, and it offered itself, crucially, in order to break the working class movement physically. So this is the split, the SA, the brown shirts, the physical attacks upon the organised working class, in order to demonstrate to the capitalist class that they would be able to deal with the problem of the threat of revolution. You go through all sorts of, in 3 years, you go through all sorts of combinations of government, attempts by the military and by the old right to deal with the insurgency of the working class. Ultimately, they can't. And despite the fact that they did not want the Nazis to take power because it would be too destabilizing, because all of this talk of being anti-capitalist, they were forced in 1933 to do it because they'd exhausted all the other options. So we have with fascism, pseudo-anti-capitalism, a racism or similar ideology which binds it together, initially an appeal to the alienated middle class, and then trying to move out in concentric circles, all of which to prove your usefulness to the ruling class, so that eventually that they will tolerate you coming to power, or in the words of one of the bourgeois then, we've hired him, we've hired Hitler in 1933. That was the process that took place. Now, and it led to, within a year of Hitler being handed power, the complete dissolution of all of the other political structures and the merging of the Nazi Party into the state, and all of the things that we know flow from that. Now, of course, the Second World War brings an end to that. The 60s into the 70s, outright fascism is largely discredited, but you have a reorganization on the right. In the 70s, you have a new phase of crisis. The ruling class does not really anywhere turn to fascism, which exerts itself again in a new in this crisis. Instead, the people who do the trick for them to put an end to the surge of struggle and the post-1968 struggles is the Social Democrats, the reformists, who suck all the energy out of that. Now, those efforts by the fascists in the 1970s, the states turned their back on them. In Italy, just for example, there was a big fascist movement. The state used the fascists against the far left and elevated itself to say, we are the ones holding order, holding the ring, and relying upon the Social Democrats to deliver class peace. That really led, until really the last 20 years or so, to the idea that we're in a post-fascist world. We can have all sorts of racist reactionaries, but something like fascism is not going to come back. I want to say in the last, I want to say in these last 10 minutes to go through why I think that can happen, and what the contemporary process, which is, if you like, parallel to this process of radicalization in the 1920s, what that's looking like now. The reason I think it can happen is that the post the 2008 crash, financial crash, we've seen all through the advanced capitalist world, we've seen the gradual breakdown of the consensus and the mechanisms of the state to hold control. And crucially, we've seen the political breakdown of the political parties and the electoral and political system. Now, in the United States, it was sort of partially interrupted by the 8 years of Obama. I don't know if people remember this. That was supposed to signal a restoration of the process of globalization, the advance of liberal capitalism, of rights built upon what was gained in the 1960s and so on. But that proved to be an aberration, a parenthesis of what the general trajectory was, which has involved the rise of conservative reaction, then the alienation of the mass of people from a hollowed out politics. So, you know, at one level, in the 1990s into the 2000s, you think of Cameron and Blair, there was essentially no difference between them. People not voting, disengaged. At the same time, the economics not delivering for the majority of people, and that's crucially the case over the last 10 years or so. And new attempts at political mobilization on the right, which means abandoning all sorts of politics of the centre. The idea that everyone's in favour of women's equality, everyone's in favour of opposing outright racism and so on, that progressively goes by the window. And you've seen one breakthrough after another since 2008 of the radical right in all sorts of forms. You've seen it a little bit beforehand with the Le Pen's party in France, the Front National, which grew in the 1980s precisely out of the Socialist Party, the traditional party of the working class, not delivering. And not only not delivering, being prepared to play a very dangerous political game, which was to accentuate the Le Pen in the hope that they would take votes, the Front National would take votes from the traditional right. And that's a process that we've seen happening in Europe in the last 10 years or so. To be honest, it happened in Britain last year around the general election. There were people, Labour Party insiders, as they say, who were not too fussed about reform advancing because it would split the Tory vote. And we see that historically, and it's a pattern from the from the 1920s, when the Nazi Party made a turn away from trying to do a coup, which it had done in attempted in 1923. It became very much an electoral force with the street fighters. Would seem again the hope that would divide the right and that they would still remain contained. We actually went the other way. So you have the legitimization of all sorts of racist ideas and reactionary ideas. The war on terror at the beginning of this century was crucial in unleashing a kind of international form of racism in the form of Islamophobia. The Islamophobia not really coming from a hatred of Muslims in the case of Tony Blair or even George Bush, but as a necessary false explanation in the way that anti-Semitism was a necessary false explanation in the 1920s for the development of the fact that instead of the fall of Iraq leading to peace and stability and reordering the Middle East in a kind of neoliberal fantasy way, it led to massive resistance in Iraq and around the region. Why are these people on the streets of Baghdad not greeting us with rice being thrown over our heads? It's because they don't like our system, they don't like our freedom. Muslims are incompatible with bourgeois democracy and freedom. These are the kind of ideas that were pushed. The second thing that's happened is in the course of the crisis, particularly of the last 12 years, you've had a rise of state authoritarianism, which is another, if you like, precondition for fascism. And not just by right-wing governments. I don't know if people remember, but 10 years ago, France was under a state of emergency in which demonstrations could be banned, in which if we were holding a meeting like this, the police could come in and break up the meeting. And that was done by under the government of François Hollande, who was a Labour-ish president. And it was a response to the terror attacks in France. Then, a few years later, you have the Yellow Vests uprising in France. Thousands of people were hospitalized by the French police. I mean, I know, and rightly, we talk about the police repression of our demonstration. I mean, we're talking about rubber bullets being fired onto something like our demonstration a couple of weeks ago. So you have rising racism from the centre, rising authoritarianism, again from the centre, a rise of nationalism as the kind of overall idea that, well, we've got this greater globalization. I mean, it was in the mid-1990s, nation states will just dissolve. Everything will become a sea of workers and production on one level and an international capitalist class on another. Nation and nationalism are going away. We'll all become some kind of European or what have you. Instead, in each of these countries, you've seen rising nationalism and you've seen the breakdown of the political mechanisms that could incorporate discontented working class and poor people into the system. So it's in that context you've had the rise of this new right, as it were. And within that are a range of formations. If you take reform, just for brevity, reform is centred upon pulling politics to the right, and really it's centred upon splitting the Tory party, or at least forcing the Tory party way onto the terrain of the far right. And on that level, it's shown some success. You know, you have political commentators bemoaning the fact that you've got what used to be mainstream Tories party, which was one nation conservatism, is now run by Kemi Badenoch, and worse, people like Robert Jenrick, who, if you ask me, is someone who's closer to fascism than Badenoch. Why I say that is because the Labour Party on the question of refugees. I mean, how bad does it get when we don't only deport the most refugees? We're now going to do a kind of snuff movie of raiding the house, putting them in irons onto the plane, and then you see what the humiliated, probably black person in irons coming off the plane at the other end. I mean, it's disgusting. The Tories, when things move to the right, then the right-wing parties have to find their own space in a rightwards moving terrain. So the Tory party has to go further. Jenrick goes further still because he only just lost against Kemi Badenoch, and also I think would like to have a fusion of reform and a very right-wing Tory party. And so reform succeeds in this in terms of the mainstream politics. So there's that kind of party. Then there's another kind of party which is is closer to the classical fascist model, which we had in Greece, which was Golden Dawn. And there were people who tried to sanitize it by saying this is just a nationalist party. It's just maybe a far-right nationalist party. Their oath of allegiance said our central enemy is the eternal Jew. And then they listed their enemies. They crucially organized street fighting squads to use against the left and to say where the right have tried to deal politically with the left and drive them out of politics, we will drive them off the streets and break up their personnel. And they again arose out of a mishmash of the far right of the 1970s and 1980s. So what I want to end up with is, if we think of this in the context of the 1920s, you have this growing radicalization, not all of which is yet fascist, but all of which, because there's a radicalization, is on a trajectory which goes in that direction. We have to think about where we insert ourselves to stop that process. The very final thing is that requires a unity on the left, bringing together people who want to stop the fascists, to bring together the broadest number of people, but also in a very militant and combative way. And what I mean by that is that if we say we're all against racism, like the Labour Party will say it's all against racism, and we just think we can propagandise on that basis, we miss out what's driving the fascists forward, which is, they say, the government says it'll deport refugees. We will start the process now of deporting the refugees. That's the fascist element, the Tommy Robinson element, or the reform element, very cleverly tying every single question to Islamophobia and migration and so on. We have to have something which is not just platitudinously against racism, but tries to insert itself to make those arguments. And crucially, even reformers accept this, that one, their vote is a racist vote, but large numbers of people who are voting reform are not voting on for racist reasons, but the fact that we've tried everything else and nothing works, and things are getting worse, and nobody's offering an answer. People nodding, because I think they know people who say this. So we have to think about how we come at it from that side as well. So I want to stop there, because the purpose of the introduction, because there's so many things to cover, was to try and give those clear points, and then in the discussion we can explore, and I know people have questions, is this fascist, is that fascist, what about this and the other? So we really need to use all the time and start getting the hands up now.